the humble beginning of the artist. The artist's name was Marcus Alonso, though he often signed his works with just his first name, a silent acknowledgement of the world he lived in, one where names and identities were often defined by circumstances beyond their control. Marcus grew up in a quiet neighborhood in the heart of Atlanta, Georgia, a place where families struggled but held tight to their pride. His mother, a schoolteacher, and his father, a mechanic, made ends meet with love and hard work, always reminding him that greatness could come from the most unexpected places. From a young age, Marcus showed an innate talent for art. His mother often said that he could draw before he could speak, tracing simple shapes on scraps of paper before he could form coherent sentences. The walls of their small home were covered in his early attempts at recreating the world around him, his sketchbook a constant companion. He'd draw the faces of his family members, the tall oaks in his backyard, and the faces of the people walking down the streets of their neighborhood. Art was his escape, his language. The more he drew, the more he realized that each line, each stroke of color, could tell a story, a truth that felt deeper than words. However, growing up Black in a city like Atlanta, where systemic barriers often defined what opportunities would be accessible to you, Marcus knew that his dreams of becoming a celebrated artist would not come easy. His school art teacher, a kind but well-meaning woman, encouraged him to pursue a future in art but often subtly expressed the limits of his potential. "You have such talent, Marcus, but there are only a few places for people like you in this world," she would say. "You'll need to work twice as hard to make your mark." The subtle racial bias that colored so many of his experiences made him keenly aware of the uphill battle that awaited him. As he grew older, the divide between the worlds he wanted to be a part of and the one he lived in became even more apparent. The art scene in Atlanta was fragmented. Predominantly white gallery spaces featured artists who were often more established, more recognized. He found it difficult to break into those circles, to have his work taken seriously. His style was raw, expressive, and carried the weight of history, of culture, of a life lived with constant resilience. But to many, it seemed too unrefined, too different from the accepted conventions of what art was supposed to be. His passion for art never waned, even when the constant rejection from galleries and exhibitions felt like a silent reminder of his place in a world where Black voices often struggled to find a stage. He had no resources, no connections, and no formal training beyond what he learned from local community art centers. His family couldn't afford art schools, so he taught himself through books, YouTube tutorials, and by visiting the few galleries that would let him in. He spent hours on his artwork, honing his technique, trying to capture emotions that words could never quite describe. But still, when he showed up at exhibitions, when he knocked on gallery doors, the response was the same, polite interest, but always with a hidden message that he needed to try harder, to be more like the others. But Marcus was not someone who gave up easily. The adversity he faced only fueled his desire to succeed. And so, he made the difficult decision to leave Atlanta behind. His heart was set on New York City, the art capital of the world. But moving to a place as vast and competitive as New York, with little more than a few $100s in his pocket and the dreams of a lifetime in his hands, was a bold step. He knew that breaking through would take years, but he was determined to find a way. He arrived in the city with nothing but a suitcase of clothes, a backpack full of sketches, and a profound sense of hope. The city was both exhilarating and overwhelming, filled with the sounds of artists, performers, and creatives hustling in every direction. Marcus knew that in a city this large, it would be easy to get lost, easy to fade into the background. But he didn't want to fade, he wanted to make a statement. In those early days, he stayed in tiny, inexpensive rooms on the outskirts of Brooklyn, sharing space with other aspiring artists and dreamers who were all chasing their own versions of success. He found a few part-time jobs to support himself, waiting tables, working as a janitor at a local gallery, painting murals on the sides of buildings, and spent every other waking moment creating. His small apartment became his sanctuary, filled with unfinished works that seemed to breathe with the weight of his ambition. Marcus knew that if he wanted to make it, he needed to be seen. He began attending open gallery nights, taking part in community exhibitions, and meeting anyone who would listen to his story. But no matter how many nights he spent introducing himself to curators or other artists, he still found himself largely invisible. The art world, with all its glitter and charm, felt like an exclusive club that only let a few in, those who had the right connections, the right pedigree, and the right image. Marcus was none of those things. The gallery owner's perspective. Victoria Carlyle prided herself on being one of the most influential gallery owners in Manhattan. With her impeccable sense of style and a knack for spotting trends before they exploded onto the mainstream, she had cultivated a reputation as the gatekeeper of high art. Her gallery, Carlyle Contemporary, was the kind of place that aspiring artists dreamed of being featured in, spacious, impeccably lit, and frequented by collectors who thought nothing of spending six figures on a single piece. Victoria's journey to the top wasn't without its own struggles, though she would rarely admit it. Born into an affluent family with ties to the art world, she attended the best schools, interned at prestigious museums, and eventually opened her gallery in Soho in her early 30s. Her reputation was built on curating exhibitions that featured the work of well-established artists, with a few rising stars handpicked by her to maintain the illusion that her gallery welcomed fresh talent. However, her definition of rising stars often excluded anyone who didn't fit the narrow mold of what she deemed marketable. Victoria's cynicism toward up-and-coming artists stemmed from years of sifting through countless submissions that she deemed uninspired. She had a set belief that only a handful of artists were truly worthy of attention, and those typically came from elite institutions or had connections to influential figures in the art world. To her, art was not just about creativity, it was about pedigree, reputation, and, most importantly, profitability. She wasn't in the business of nurturing talent, she was in the business of selling it. Her preference for established names and certain demographics was unspoken but palpable. Victoria believed she was a realist, not a racist or a gatekeeper. She convinced herself that she was simply reflecting what collectors wanted: safe, conventional works from artists who fit neatly into the European tradition or modern avant-garde movements that were already established in the market. Artists who didn't conform to these norms, particularly Black artists whose work often explored themes of identity, struggle, and culture, were viewed as too niche or political for her clientele. Marcus Alonso, an unknown artist from Atlanta, was the kind of person Victoria would overlook without a second thought. He didn't have the academic credentials, the social connections, or the polished image she believed were essential to success in the art world. To her, he was just another dreamer trying to break into a world he didn't belong in. One evening, Victoria hosted one of her exclusive gallery events. These gatherings were as much about networking as they were about the art on display. The room was filled with the city's elite, art collectors, critics, and socialites sipping champagne as they discussed the latest pieces gracing her walls. The featured artist that night was a minimalist sculptor whose work, while technically impressive, was devoid of the raw emotion that Marcus's paintings carried. Marcus, unaware of Victoria's biases or her gallery's reputation, attended the event. He had managed to secure an invitation through a friend who worked in the gallery's administrative office. Clutching his portfolio, he navigated the sea of sharply dressed patrons, feeling out of place but determined to make an impression. He knew it was a long shot, but he hoped that showing his work to someone like Victoria could open doors he had spent years trying to unlock. When Marcus finally approached Victoria, she was standing near a large abstract sculpture, deep in conversation with a potential buyer. Politely waiting for a pause, he introduced himself and mentioned that he was an artist hoping to get her feedback on his work. Her eyes flicked over him briefly, her expression unreadable. "Of course," she said with a perfunctory smile, more out of politeness than genuine interest. As Marcus opened his portfolio, Victoria glanced at the first few pieces, a series of vibrant, emotionally charged paintings that captured the struggles and triumphs of urban life. They were filled with bold colors, dynamic forms, and layers of texture that demanded attention. However, Victoria barely looked at them before she started speaking. "These are interesting," she said, her tone detached. "But I don't think they'd resonate with our clientele. The style is a bit raw, don't you think? Almost amateurish." Marcus, taken aback, tried to explain the thought process behind his work, the stories, the emotions, the culture embedded in each stroke. But Victoria cut him off with a slight wave of her hand. I appreciate your passion, but the market is very specific about what it wants. This kind of work doesn't really fit with our current exhibitions. It's not refined enough. Her words stung, but what hurt more was the casual dismissal in her tone, as though his art, and by extension, his voice, wasn't worth her time. She didn't ask about his background, his inspiration, or his process. To her, Marcus was just another aspiring artist whose work she could dismiss without a second thought. Victoria turned back to the collector she had been speaking to before Marcus approached, effectively ending the conversation. Marcus stood there for a moment, his portfolio still open, before closing it quietly and walking away. As he left the gallery, he overheard Victoria making a flippant comment to her colleague, another one of those artists who think passion is enough. They don't understand the business of art. The artist's struggle and growth. As Marcus walked home from the gallery that night, Victoria Carlyle's words echoed in his mind. Raw. Amateurish. Not refined enough. The casual dismissal stung deeply, not just because it was cruel, but because it was a reflection of the rejection he had faced time and time again. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was his work truly as unworthy as she made it seem? Was he chasing a dream that was impossible to achieve? But beneath the sting of rejection, Marcus felt a fire reignite, a determination to prove her, and every other doubter, wrong. He knew his art carried a power that wasn't measured by the superficial standards of the gallery elite. His paintings were filled with stories, struggles, and triumphs that couldn't be reduced to a simple critique. He wasn't creating to fit into their world, he was creating to share his own. That night, Marcus made a promise to himself, he would not give up. Refining his voice. In the weeks that followed, Marcus dove headfirst into his work. He spent countless hours in his tiny Brooklyn apartment, transforming his frustration into creativity. He scrutinized every detail of his art, not to conform to other standards, but to elevate his own voice. Marcus began experimenting with new techniques, blending bold colors and textures with intricate details that told layered stories. His work became even more personal, drawing from his experiences growing up in Atlanta, the struggles of his community, and the resilience that had defined his journey. While he continued refining his style, Marcus also immersed himself in learning about the art world. He read books about the history of Black artists, attended workshops, and studied the works of painters who had managed to carve a path, despite the odds stacked against them. He realized that his art didn't have to appeal to everyone, it just needed to resonate with the right people, those who understood the depth of his message and appreciated his unique perspective. The underground scene. Marcus began to find his footing in the underground art world, a vibrant and diverse community that thrived outside the boundaries of mainstream galleries. These spaces were filled with artists who, like him, had been overlooked or dismissed by traditional institutions. They held pop-up exhibitions in abandoned warehouses, showcased their work on the walls of local cafes, and created online platforms to share their art with the world. Through these connections, Marcus's work began to find an audience. People were drawn to the raw emotion and authenticity in his paintings. His pieces spoke to experiences that many could relate to but rarely saw reflected in art. Slowly but surely, Marcus started gaining recognition within this underground network. Collectors who valued innovation over tradition began taking notice of his work, purchasing pieces directly from him at modest prices. With each sale, Marcus gained not only financial stability but also confidence. For the first time, he felt like his art was being appreciated for what it was, not dismissed for what it wasn't. Word of mouth spread, and soon he was being invited to underground exhibitions across the city. Though he was still far from the mainstream art world, Marcus was carving out a space where his voice could be heard. The wealthy collectors. It wasn't long before Marcus's work caught the attention of a few influential collectors. One evening, at a pop-up exhibition in a converted warehouse in Queens, a collector named Daniel Harrington stumbled upon Marcus's paintings. Harrington was a wealthy entrepreneur with a passion for discovering undiscovered talent. He was struck by the intensity and depth of Marcus's work, and by the end of the night, he had purchased 3 pieces. Harrington wasn't the only one. Over the next several months, more collectors began buying Marcus's work. Each sale came with a story of its own, a collector who saw their own struggles reflected in his art, a philanthropist who wanted to support emerging Black artists, or a historian who appreciated the cultural significance of his themes. These buyers were different from the crowd at Victoria Carlyle's gallery. They valued authenticity over status, and they saw Marcus's work as a testament to resilience and creativity. Financial backing and growing success. As Marcus's reputation grew, so did the value of his paintings. What had once sold for a few $100s was now fetching thousands. With the financial backing of his collectors, Marcus was able to afford better materials and larger canvases. He upgraded his tiny apartment studio to a shared loft space, where he could work on more ambitious pieces. Marcus began receiving invitations to exhibit at more prominent underground galleries, and some of his paintings even made their way to private auctions. Though his name was still relatively unknown in the mainstream art world, his work was beginning to circulate among influential circles. Collectors who purchased his art began sharing it with their networks, further amplifying his reach. Despite his growing success, Marcus remained grounded. He continued to draw inspiration from his community and stayed connected to the people who had supported him from the beginning. He saw his success not just as a personal achievement but as a way to pave the way for other artists like him. Plot twist, the artist's new identity. A breakthrough moment. Years of persistence and growth culminated in an event that would forever change Marcus Alonso's life. One of his paintings, a large, evocative piece titled Resilience Unfolded, found its way into the hands of an influential collector, Daniel Harrington. Harrington, impressed by Marcus's authenticity and emotional depth, decided to showcase the painting at an exclusive art auction. This wasn't just any auction, it was a prestigious event where the wealthiest art enthusiasts gathered to bid on works by both established masters and undiscovered talent. The painting, with its bold brushstrokes and layers of vivid color, caught the attention of several high-profile bidders. Its raw emotion resonated deeply, sparking a bidding war that ended with the piece selling for an astounding $2.3 million. The auctioneer announced the sale with a mix of excitement and intrigue, as Marcus Alonso, the artist behind the masterpiece, was still largely a mystery. His anonymity only added to the allure, and soon, collectors across the art world were clamoring to learn more about him. The news of this rising star spread like wildfire. Critics hailed him as a visionary, praising his ability to channel personal and cultural narratives into stunning visual forms. Articles speculated about his background, some comparing his work to that of Basquiat and other trailblazing Black artists. Yet, despite the growing buzz, Marcus remained intentionally elusive. He wanted the world to focus on his art, not on his identity. Still, curiosity mounted, and whispers of his meteoric rise reached even the upper echelons of the traditional art world. The gallery owner takes notice. Among those who heard of Marcus's sudden success was Victoria Carlyle. The name Marcus Alonso meant nothing to her at first, but she couldn't ignore the impact his work was having. The art circles she frequented buzzed with stories of this enigmatic artist whose paintings were now fetching millions. Collectors she knew personally were praising his genius, and more than one had expressed regret at not discovering him earlier. Victoria felt a mix of emotions, excitement at the possibility of connecting with this rising star and frustration that she hadn't been the one to discover him. She prided herself on her ability to spot talent, yet somehow, this artist had slipped through her fingers. Determined to make amends, she began searching for any information she could find about him, even considering reaching out to his representatives to feature his work in her gallery. What she didn't realize, of course, was that she had already met Marcus years ago, and dismissed him outright. A return to the gallery. As Marcus's fame grew, so did his confidence. He had long since shed the insecurities that once plagued him, and he now stood firmly in his identity as an artist. Yet, there was one chapter of his journey that felt unfinished, the encounter with Victoria Carlyle. Her dismissive words had been a turning point for him, a catalyst that pushed him to refine his craft and prove himself. Now, with his work celebrated and valued at the highest levels, he felt it was time to revisit the place where his journey toward validation truly began. Dressed sharply but unassumingly, Marcus walked into Carlisle Contemporary one evening during one of its many exclusive events. The gallery looked much the same as it had years ago, with its polished floors, pristine walls, and glittering crowd. This time, however, Marcus entered not as an outsider hoping for validation, but as an artist whose name was now on the lips of collectors worldwide. Victoria noticed him almost immediately. Though she didn't recognize him, there was something about his confident demeanor that caught her attention. Assuming he was a wealthy collector or influential figure, she approached him with her signature charm. "Welcome to Carlisle Contemporary," she said warmly. "I don't believe we've met before. I'm Victoria Carlisle, the owner. May I ask what brings you to our gallery?" Marcus smiled faintly. "I've been here before," he replied. "A long time ago. Back then, I was just another artist looking for a chance." Victoria's expression flickered with curiosity. "Really? I see so many faces, it's hard to keep track. Are you an artist yourself?" "I am," Marcus said, his tone steady. "You might have heard of me recently. Marcus Alonso." The name hit her like a thunderbolt. Her polished composure faltered as realization dawned. The artist everyone was talking about, the one whose paintings were now selling for millions, was standing in front of her. And then it clicked. She remembered the young man she had dismissed years ago, his portfolio in hand, his voice filled with passion. The very same artist whose work she had called raw and amateurish. The revelation. "You," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It's you." Marcus nodded. "It's me." Victoria's mind raced as she tried to piece together her response. "Marcus, I didn't realize. If I had known." "You didn't," Marcus interjected calmly. "And that's the point. You didn't see me then, because I didn't fit your idea of what an artist should be. But my work hasn't changed, it's the same truth I showed you years ago. The only difference is now the world sees its value." Victoria struggled to find the right words. I was wrong. Truly, I was. Your work is extraordinary, and I'd love the opportunity to." Marcus held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "I didn't come here for an apology or an opportunity. I came to remind myself of where I started, and how far I've come." Victoria stared at him, a mixture of admiration, regret, and discomfort etched on her face. She realized that the man standing before her no longer needed her approval or her gallery. He had surpassed everything she thought she understood about the art world. A shocking gesture. Before leaving, Marcus turned to Victoria with a faint smile. "There's one more thing. I've decided to expand my reach in the art world. I'm buying galleries across the city to create spaces for artists who were ignored, just like I was. Carlisle Contemporary might be next on my list." Victoria's eyes widened in shock, and for the first time, she was truly speechless. Marcus had not only proven her wrong, but had risen to a level where he now held the power she once wielded. As he walked out of the gallery, Marcus felt a sense of closure. His success was no longer defined by the approval of gatekeepers like Victoria Carlisle. It was his own determination, talent, and belief in his art that had brought him to this moment. And now, he was determined to use his platform to open doors for others, to create a world where no artist would have to fight as hard as he had to be seen. The gallery owner's reaction. Victoria Carlisle stood frozen in the center of her gallery, her mind spinning. The revelation of Marcus Alonso's identity had shaken her to her core. She had dismissed him years ago, reducing his talent to superficial critiques, and now, he was a celebrated artist whose name was on the lips of collectors, critics, and patrons worldwide. Her gallery, once considered a bastion of contemporary art, now seemed insignificant compared to the influence Marcus wielded. For days after their encounter, Victoria was plagued by regret. She replayed her dismissive words in her mind, the image of Marcus standing humbly before her with his portfolio, his eyes brimming with hope. She had been blind to his talent, too consumed by her biases and preconceptions to recognize the brilliance right in front of her. Now, she was desperate to repair the damage. Victoria attempted to reach out to Marcus. She sent emails to his representatives, left voicemails, and even had her assistants draft formal invitations to host his work in her gallery. Each attempt was met with silence. Marcus had moved on, and her sudden interest in his success was too little, too late. The artist's strategic move. While Victoria fretted over how to salvage her reputation, Marcus was busy building his empire. The success of his paintings at auction had not only solidified his place in the art world but also provided him with the financial resources to effect meaningful change. True to his word, he began acquiring galleries across the city, transforming them into spaces where emerging and underrepresented artists could showcase their work without fear of rejection or bias. Among the galleries Marcus considered for acquisition was Carlisle Contemporary. The idea of owning the very space where he had once been mocked was poetic. It wasn't about revenge, it was about rewriting the narrative and creating a legacy. Marcus reached out to Victoria with a formal offer to purchase a controlling stake in the gallery. When Victoria received the proposal, her initial reaction was a mix of disbelief and indignation. She had spent years building Carlisle Contemporary into a symbol of prestige. How could she relinquish control? But as she read through Marcus's offer, she realized it wasn't a hostile takeover. He wasn't seeking to dismantle her legacy, he wanted to transform it. The terms of the agreement allowed her to remain involved as a consultant, but Marcus would have the final say in the gallery's direction. Desperate to salvage her standing in the art world and recognizing the inevitability of Marcus's rise, Victoria reluctantly agreed. A reimagined Carlisle Contemporary. Under Marcus's leadership, Carlisle Contemporary underwent a dramatic transformation. The sterile, exclusive atmosphere that had once defined the gallery was replaced with a vibrant, inclusive ethos. The walls now showcased a diverse array of artists, many of whom had been overlooked by traditional institutions. Community engagement became a cornerstone of the gallery's mission, with workshops, artist talks, and public exhibitions that invited everyone, regardless of background, to experience and create art. Marcus's influence extended far beyond the gallery. He used his growing platform to advocate for systemic change in the art world, challenging the elitism and biases that had kept so many talented artists from being recognized. His journey became an inspiration, a testament to resilience, and a call to action for others to uplift voices that had long been silenced. The gallery owner's realization. As Carlisle Contemporary flourished under Marcus's guidance, Victoria found herself reflecting on her past decisions. She attended the gallery's exhibitions, watching as artists from all walks of life shared their work with an enthusiastic and diverse audience. The energy in the space was unlike anything she had experienced before. For the first time, she saw the art world through a new lens, one that valued authenticity, emotion, and community over pedigree and profit. Victoria couldn't ignore the irony of her situation. The artist she had once dismissed had not only proven her wrong but had also taken her gallery to heights she could never have imagined. She began to understand the depth of her mistake, not just in overlooking Marcus's talent but in failing to see the potential of so many others like him. Humbled, Victoria approached Marcus during one of the gallery's exhibitions. "I want to thank you," she said quietly, her voice sincere. "For what you've done, not just for the gallery, but for the art world. You've shown me how much I still have to learn." Marcus regarded her for a moment, then offered a faint smile. "It's never too late to grow," he said. "We're all part of the same story. It's up to us to make it better." The artist's empire and legacy. As the years passed, Marcus's influence continued to grow. His network of galleries expanded across the country, each one dedicated to uplifting underrepresented voices. He established scholarships for aspiring artists, funded community art programs, and partnered with schools to ensure that children from marginalized communities had access to creative opportunities. Marcus's own art remained a central part of his legacy. His paintings, now displayed in major museums and private collections worldwide, were celebrated not just for their aesthetic brilliance but for the stories they told, the stories of struggle, resilience, and triumph.